Another joint get-together between the planning board and city council. Really appreciate your time today. I'm going to invite Sarah Showalter here, the director for our planning services division here at CPD, to give a few introductory remarks, and then we'll try it in.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for making the time to be here today. I know how busy you are and it's a lot. Jill, our acting executive director, is on her way over, so she will be here as well, and said to tell you all hi in the meantime. So if there's anybody that spends more time thinking about the complexity of the zoning criteria than staff, it's you. You guys have the joy of pretty much on a weekly basis thinking about zoning criteria, so we are very excited to get your input today. I think, you know, advancing activity rezoning is a big project with a lot of pieces, but we're focusing today on the rezoning criteria in particular. And we intentionally separated this discussion into two parts. There's a lot of criteria and a lot to cover because of an hour and a half, a lot of stuff today. So we're excited that we'll be back in April to talk more about it. And also appreciate that you gave us the opportunity to preview some of the content with the planning board last week and city council on Monday at budget and policy committee, so we can just dive in today. So thanks again for being here. We're excited to hear.
Great, thank you, Sarah, and thanks everybody for being here. I'm Brandon Shaver, Senior Street Planner and Project Manager for Advancing Equity and Rezoning. Also joined my colleague Brett Hay, who is going to be delivering our staff evaluation and proposal. So with that, we'll get started. We're very excited to build on the foundation that we set with you all last week. So briefly going to go over a recap of what we talked about there, and then also giving through the big support strategies this project is proposing, and we've also went through with you guys before. And then I'll hand it over to Rob, where he's going to go through staff's evaluation of our review criteria as well as our proposal, and then we'll leave plenty of time for questions. We have an interactive activity for you all to do, and talk about upcoming discussion points at the very end. So first, a reminder of our 4 key strategies. We presented these approaches to both planning board and Moody back in October for strategy number 1 and number 2. For the first one, tailoring process requirements based on a variety of factors. We really stress the importance of CPD's shift towards doing more city-led proactive rezonings coming out of this project. I think that that's going to really cut down on the number of applicant-driven rezonings that you're all evaluating on a consistent basis. And we really think that that really shows how dedicated our department is to proactively setting the vision in zoning that we see in our plans. For creating accessible and clear opportunities, you'll remember that a big key component here is that we are going to, after this project, start noticing renters and business tenants, not just property owners. That's a really big shift for us. And also thinking about an expanded noticing radius and engagement requirement for those rezonings that have really big equity concerns. So these improvements are all working together to create more opportunity for community members to engage with our process, and these will all really well received by members and planning board back in out. We have started some work internally on strategy number 3, ensuring commitments to equitable outcomes. We're very excited to share those ideas with you in a future meeting. Keep in mind that all of these strategies really work together, and it's hard to get too advanced in one before bringing one's behind it along. So with that in mind, we really want to focus today's conversation on number 4, which is our initial proposal for revisions to the rezoning review criteria. And this project has an issue identification report that was published over a year ago. There are 5 major issue categories that we're trying to solve for the project. But specific for today's conversation, we really want to focus on the review criteria being unclear or vague. I think even in the updates that we've provided with you all in the last couple of weeks, there's a lot of vagueness and unclearness in our review criteria, and we're expecting the public to understand our review criteria and be able to speak to them when they come to speak in support or opposition of an application. So I think this is a really big part for us to clean up. And with that, I'm just going to leave the current review criteria on the screen here before Rob dives in. I think 2 key things to point out here is first, in our discussion with you all the last week or so, we think there's a lot of room for improvement in how we interpret public health, safety, and general welfare. I think that's going to be a really big component of today's conversation. And I think another thing here is that you'll see that the first 3 review criteria are only applicable or are applicable to all zone map amendments. And then we have additional review criteria for non-legislative rezoning. So they just spoke about us being more proactive with city-led and legislative rezoning, so think about that. And also our task force is thinking about that this week, because that's what our focus is for our small working groups. And with that, I will pass it over to Rob, who will give you our evaluation and proposal.
Thanks, Brandon. Did everyone hear me okay? Good, that Don's in the back. This feels like a funny setup that we're like up here like panelists. We wanted to make sure that everyone had enough room down there, so last minute decided to shift up here, but
Like judges.
like. Let it go, role reversal a little bit, role reversal thing, come down there. Anyway, all right, so as Brandon introduced, we'll take a look at each of the review criteria, what staff's considerations were that we looked at when we were developing our preferred approaches or proposals. And then we'll take a look at what each of those proposals is. I think ideally we would love to stop and break and have a conversation at each of these proposals. However, with a group this size, and just to make sure that we can kind of focus on really the most consequential parts of the conversation, we'll go through all of them and then have discussion at the end. As Brendan mentioned, we do have a little activity to kind of guide some of that conversation so that starting the discussion, we can focus on what we've identified as kind of the real discussion points, and kind of we can put away the things that everyone agrees on if there are any. So first, as Brendan introduced, these are our current review criteria. We'll be focusing our discussion today on first of all the first three that apply to all zone map amendments or rezonings, and we'll also be looking at the consistency with neighborhood context description, zone district purpose, and intent statements. We will be holding the discussion for a justifying circumstance, as well as any of the potential equity considerations criteria or other process improvements for a later meeting. So those kind of deserve their own discussion themselves. But with that in mind, we'll kind of just jump right into the first criterion, which is consistency with adopted plans. So this is the language that's in the code in quotations here. The proposed official map amendment is consistent with the city's adopted plans, or the proposed rezoning is necessary to provide land for a community need that was not anticipated at the time of the adoption of the city's plan. So first, this first sentence is really that the plan or that the proposed rezoning is consistent with the adopted plans. The rezonings are a really important part of the implementation of our plans, and so finding that they be consistent is a really crucial part of what makes rezonings important and why they should be approved. When we looked around at our peer cities, we did find that all of our peer cities have some type of criteria that requires consistency with their adopted plans. This is largely because of the within the enabling legislation or whatever power they're granted in order to enact zoning regulations or land use regulations that's done so in accordance with the comprehensive plan. And Denver has similar language within our city charter. Just like I just said, so the Denver City Charter does require that zoning regulation be consistent with the adopted comprehensive plan, and that also includes all of its supplements, which is Blueprint Denver and any of the area plans and neighborhood plans that have been adopted by City Council and recommended for approval by Planning Board. This criterion also includes this kind of funny provision that states that a rezoning can also be approved for a community need that was not anticipated when the plan was adopted. So when staff was looking at this, this is something that's rarely used. This is something that we occasionally will get a question about from an applicant that says, hey, what about this phrase? Can I use this? Even though my rezoning isn't consistent with the adopted plans. And that is really held aside for some very rare circumstances, probably that you might be aware of coming through from time to time. However, when kind of making this out of evaluation, staff considers that this is really maybe something different altogether than whether or not rezoning is supposed to be the adopted plan. We're proposing to relocate this provision somewhere else within the criteria that we'll discuss in a future meeting, but we will propose to retain the plan consistency language fairly similarly to how it is now, which is very straightforward that the rezoning is consistent with that adopted plan for those adopted plans. All right, so moving on to uniformity with district regulations. And again, we'll have a moment for questions for clarity, and then we'll get into the discussion after we get through each of these. So the next criterion is uniformity with district regulations and restrictions. So the way this reads in the code is that the proposed official map amendment results in regulations and restrictions that are uniform for each kind of building throughout each district, having the same classification and bearing the same symbol or designation on the official map. But the regulations in one district may differ from those in another district. So really what this means is that a USC C1 zone district in any part of the city would have the same regulations, building forms, restrictions as a USU C1 zone district anywhere else in the city. This would apply for any zone district as long as they bear the same letters, numbers, and symbols. This language is similar, or there's similar language in the city charter as well as in the Standard Zoning Enabling Act, which we'll look at later. And this language exists in former Chapter 59, which, as you know, was the zone which governed zoning regulations in the city prior to 2010, and now governs zoning regulations in only a portion of the city. However, the location of this language in former Chapter 59 applies to both text amendments and zone map amendments. So that is a potential reason that this was carried forward through that time. And in the city charter, it really speaks to why when we're creating the regulations in the text of the code, that these same zone districts need to be governed in the same way. For that reason, staff believes that this language really needs to be, or is most appropriately applied to zoning text amendments rather than map amendments, since a rezoning request doesn't change how the regulations within a zone district are really, doesn't impact them at all. We're just changing where that district exists on the map. That this is not something that is really needed to be part of the rezoning consideration and analysis. Often this language is full of jargon and it's very often used or misinterpreted by the public, and this kind of makes it difficult for them to more accurately guide their public comment to address the criteria in a way that we didn't bring it into our consideration of a recommendation for. So with that, we'll move into the discussion for the public health, safety, and welfare criteria. And as Brandon introduced, this is kind of the criteria that's gotten the most attention. We'll take a look. There's a few slides that we'll look at about public health, safety, and general welfare. Not only why it's here, but where it comes from as well. So this language is really reflection of the language that exists in other governing documents that confirms the legitimacy of zoning as a police power, which then we use to develop regulations for land uses. So our land use regulations are put in place in order to protect the public health, safety, morals, and general welfare as described in the city charter and the Denver zoning code. And that's basically what this is reiterating here. A standalone criterion, right? So one that really just says that the rezoning must promote public health, safety, and general welfare is fairly rare. The majority of cities that we do see that have language that is basically a public health, safety, and general welfare criterion has other caveats along with it, kind of guide how those governing bodies should look and consider that language as well. Rezonings or criteria in really just ambiguous language like this in general does have connections to zoning's exclusionary history, and it's important to remember that and how this ambiguous language over time has been used to unjust social biases and racial biases in zoning decisions and just the establishment of zoning in general. So again, this is another criteria that is often misinterpreted and misused. It is often used to discuss other external impacts that may or may not result from development, traffic impacts, impacts on property values, perceptions of increased crime that may not have any actual connection to the change in zoning. Another reason that this can be problematic, particularly when we're looking at comments from the public or considering this these types of impacts, is that it makes it difficult to separate this consideration and this criterion from a specific project where we might look at what the traffic impacts might be, but it's difficult to apply that to a zone district that allows for so many different. So more on public health, safety, and general welfare, really where this is kind of a history slide where this language comes from. So this language originally was applied to zoning itself in land uses during a court decision in 1926, the Ambler versus Euclid, where a decision was made that basically ratified the cities in general, municipalities' ability to regulate land in order to protect public health, safety, and general welfare. Shortly after that, the federal government created this document called the Standard State Zoning Enabling Act. This was sort of a guidance document for states to structure their state statutes that would allow the statutory municipalities authority or police power to govern land use of the municipality. Denver, however, is a home rule municipality, so we're not governed by those parts of state statute. Our authority comes from what's in our city charter. Our city charter does include a lot of the language, often almost verbatim. It's in that Standard State Zoning Enabling Act. So that language specifically states that charter empowers the council of the city and county of Denver to regulate land uses and structures for the purposes of promoting health, safety, morals, and general welfare. That these regulations shall be made in accordance with a comprehensive plan. And then finally, another place this language shows up in our regulations is within the Denver zoning code. The Denver zoning code in Article 1, within the purpose statement, states that the code is enacted to implement the first comprehensive plan and guide orderly development of the city that preserves and promotes the public health, safety, prosperity, and welfare of its inhabitants. So when we're considering how we're looking at public health, safety, and general welfare during a rezoning request and review, it's first important to understand that this power to regulate land in general was given to us in order to promote public health, safety, and general welfare of the citizens of Denver. Furthermore, that regulation must be done in order in accordance with the comprehensive plan. And these comprehensive plans, neighborhood plans, are adopted in order to promote public health, safety, and general welfare. Furthermore, because a rezoning, or if a rezoning is found to be consistent with the adopted plan and advance the goals, policies of the adopted plans, it's kind of this link starts to be created between the consistency with adopted plans and advancing public health, safety, and welfare. It's important to note, and I'll pause here for a second, that the amount of engagement within the community that occurs during a planning process, plans adoption, much greater than those who can come out and speak to a rezoning request. Therefore, there's a concern that if maybe a vocal minority comes out and speaks to more ambiguous concerns, maybe about traffic or about some other concern that a lot of times is dealt in other regulations, whether it be the Denver the zoning code or building code, they could potentially undermine the overall priority and vision of the plan that was kind of articulated based on this larger engagement process, and it better encapsulates the community's vision for their neighborhood. And so again, as I alluded to, there are other tools in Denver's regulatory toolbox that further public health, safety, and welfare after the rezoning has been approved. And therefore, because of all of these things, our proposal includes integrating the plan consistency criteria with the general public health, safety, and general welfare criteria. This reduces possibilities for contradiction if one criteria is found, if the plan consistency is found to be met, but not general public health, safety, general welfare. That reduces that contradiction in the area of conflict. Also prevents the all of the hard work that went into the plan by the community, staff, the council members who are involved in those plans and so forth, for being undermined by maybe a smaller group. And kind of ties those two together. Now, again, we're looking at all these within concept. We don't have this language drafted, but it would be integrated into a single concept rather than that's really tied to plan consistency for public health, safety, and welfare, rather than being kind of an and statement that would kind of consider them separately.
Can I stop you and ask you a quick question right there? So I understand that ambiguity is, you are viewing ambiguity as a bad thing. But I guess I don't agree with that, but also I don't understand why we want to reduce the possibility for contradiction. Like, the whole point of a public hearing is to hear all sides. And that might be people who disagree with us, but that's okay. It's their right to come out and disagree with us. So I just, I'm really uncomfortable with this one.
That's a great comment. I think that is exactly the type of discussion that we're going to have following this presentation. That's the kind of.
Cool, thanks.
Okay, so the last criterion that we're going to be assessing and evaluating today is the consistency with neighborhood context description, purpose, and intent statements. So the language in the code here is that the proposed official map amendment is consistent with the description of the applicable neighborhood context and the stated purpose and intent of the proposed zone district. So these statements that are being discussed here are those that are in the beginning of each article in the Denver zoning code and describe each zone district, where they might be located in the city. It describes the context, block forms, whether or not there are alleys, how consistent are the sidewalks, where are driveways located. All of these things are within these descriptions. However, now all of our plans that are currently being developed, as well as the citywide blueprint Denver, do have guidance for future contexts, as well as language about that really closely aligns with a lot of this language, just kind of the way that it's written. If a certain type of development that supports a certain type of uses in a certain corridor with certain pedestrian or vehicular balances and so on and so forth. And because of that connection between the plans and this language, without this criteria, staff is already doing this analysis, and I'm assuming that that's happening a lot with the bodies as well. When you're evaluating whether or not a particular zone district is appropriate based on that guidance, that street type, future street type, future neighborhood context, future type, so on. And again, this is very jargon filled, and if you don't know the ins and outs of the Denver zoning code, this is important to understand. So for the members of the public and community, this is very confusing. They look at the word context and think, oh, like this is just the surrounding area, or this is really speaking specifically to something that's in the Denver zoning code. Therefore, our team is proposing to remove this criteria.
Rob, and for the group, I'm happy to keep a queue. Councilmember Mayor Campbell just asked me about that, for both groups, I think.
Yeah, please.
Okay.
Okay, that's a good segue. I think, at that point, we've gone through all of our proposals. I first want to, I'll share a Mentimeter link, but as I do that, want to ask and make sure that everyone is clear, not on why or what, not on why or what our considerations were, but just is everyone clear on what we are proposing? We're proposing to remove the two criteria and combine the one. Any questions about just the concepts of that, not the discussion? We're going to get into that detail in a second. Okay, with that, Is everyone familiar with Mentimeter?
Yes.
Okay, so we'll do a quick Mentimeter activity, let's see. Set this. Okay, so the way Mentimeter works, you can point your phone up here, and get this link, and there's a couple questions. First, we'll ask if the questions are, or if our proposals address our issue statement. Then we'll kind of take it to reading, on whether or not it works. You can also enter this code on your laptop if you don't have a smart.
Yep, and then just give us all a thumbs up.
We don't need to log into that right now.
Oh, yes, we're gonna do that now.
We're gonna have discussion before I answer any questions.
Well, this is kind of to figure out what we should kind of focus our discussion on. We'll get a temperature reading on certain things. This could be your hot take, so to speak. We know things might change, and again, we're looking for you to help us change our minds on these things.
So it's looking like we're almost there.
Coming up, it's just.
Yeah.
It's just the-
They
just press
Remember
corner,
the
we have-
criteria
we have
discussion.
20 folks signed
Just
up.
like a landing page first.
Yeah.
Right, and we'll go ahead and take the slide.
Okay, we're good.
Cool.
21.
Okay, I'm gonna advance the slide, and you should see our first question pop up on your phone,
Oh.
right? Or maybe.
Are we all seeing this?
Yes.
A lot of your description good, your directions were not clear. Just saying.
Oh, are we seeing this here?
Slide.
Everyone else?
Yeah.
Okay.
Got it.
Yes, slide. And this is, we'll kind of take a reading later on whether or not like you agree, how much work this needs, things like that. But we're really looking at this question. Does this make the criteria in general easier to understand and less ambiguous? Yeah, there will be another question about, if you want to tell us this is a bad idea, there'll be an opportunity for that as well. It looks like we're getting some answers in.
It's like you, basically,
That's everyone.
Yeah,
it's like Struffle.
Okay.
great.
Let's go with it.
Everyone answered, ready to move on to the next one?
Yes.
All right.
Well, this is what they do.
It's
Non-binary.
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 All right, so this next, removing consistency with neighborhood context, description, zone district purpose, and intended state. Does this make the criteria easier to understand or less ambiguous? This one seems a little bit more balanced. The first got a couple zeros, mostly higher numbers still though.
Understand it less.
Low ones coming in. So see, this helps us all as a group kind of figure out, oh, maybe this one we need to.
So it's not a,
Right.
I guess it's not an and, I guess it's a or.
General balance. Okay, last one of these, and then we'll move on to the next one, which is development things need. Does this combination make things easier to understand or less ambiguous? Got 4-2, this one's swinging the other way, so this is kind of what we anticipated based on previous discussions with the task force and at your so I think this is where most of our focus will be today. Looking forward to hearing all of you.
No?
I just do.
22, there we go. Awesome. Thanks. Yeah, so this one slide is just. Okay, so we've got a couple of pieces on this next one. This is just whether these need further development, whether you
They
agree
have
with
parts
this
that
approach,
have hearts too.
or whether we need to go back to the drawing board. So 5, far right in would be back to the drawing board, start over, this is a terrible idea. On the left, this is like, I like this idea, let's keep moving forward in this direction.
Rob, the question integrate means combine
That's
them.
correct.
Okay.
5111. All right, so generally it looks like so far we've got consensus that uniformity of district regulations is doesn't add a whole lot to the discussion. Definitely more work looks like we need, and again, excited to get into some of the discussion about that public health, safety, and general welfare, and then a little bit more mixed on the other two. Yeah. Awesome. Thanks all for bearing with us in this activity. This is helpful for us going forward, and I think it should help us kind of guide this next conversation. So with this and kind of at the end of this, it seems like both with this question and the first question for uniformity of district regulations, I don't need to talk a whole lot more about that. I think if folks have more discussion about it, of course, we're open to more discussion. There are some, some middle road answers. Happy to answer questions offline too, if you don't want to bring it to this group. And then that way we can kind of focus on the big questions here. So with that, I think we'll open it up. Yes, Councilmember Cashman.
I'll get you a cue. So far I've got Romero Campbell, Flynn, Glick, Marion, Sandoval, Sawyer, Cashman.
Wow.
Did I miss anyone? For comment, for discussion. Q in, okay.
That sounds good. Yeah, so I think Randy, before we go to this, we'd like to see if there's just anything else that we're missing or that jumps to mind that we need to discuss in this group. So it's an open-ended question for folks to add in whatever you might be thinking at the moment that we haven't touched on or that we really didn't touch on. And as you do that, then we're going to start to go to the queue.
I would just add that on Legistar for my colleague. If you go to special meetings and you go to the AEIR criteria history, it helps you. There's a really, I like charts and super visual. On the 10th slide, it tells you these 5 criteria, if they're in the city charter, if they came from former chapter 59, and then the additional origin of the background. So that's helpful for me as I'm having this discussion to understand where this history comes from. So if you didn't look on Legistar, there's a whole PowerPoint on Legistar for planning board members and everybody. Can you read where you have words and something? It's on Legistar,
In the
and then it
agenda
goes
for
to
today.
special
Oh,
meetings,
okay.
and then you go to the agenda, and then there's 5 items, but it's the AER criteria history.
And that was sent out to the planning board members as well. So you guys should have that in the email you got from me yesterday. If you want to
Oh, okay.
reference.
Good.
The only, I would just add, and some of the things that we're not gonna cover today, he talked about some of the other sections. One of the things that I get I've been hung up on when we're hearing preponderance of plan guidance. And then when we have conflicting language that feels exactly like it opposes the other. So just flagging that for future time. Thank you. Okay, great.
I'd also be interested in seeing the difference in those survey questions, how council responded as opposed to how planning board responded.
All anonymous though.
Yeah, for better or for worse.
I think it's relevant. It's relevant to the discussion.
I'd also like to see how it differs following a robust discussion. Want to revote?
All right, are we ready?
Ready.
Woman, you're kicking us off.
Oh dear. Okay, actually, my question was more related a little bit to process, and this is just my learning curve. In Southeast Denver, as you know, we have unincorporated Arapahoe County, and we border a lot of the other, other municipalities. Is there a time that we have criteria of who weighs in? When you said that we have the public comment, public input, do we have is there some criteria for participation, who gets to weigh in?
That's a good question.
I'll be explicit about it.
Andrew or Brandon, do you know? I haven't had a rezoning outright at the borders.
I believe that we do notice folks outside of our borders if they're within the 200 feet.
If I could answer, thank you. Robin Panicha and I changed that, and we do not. We changed the charter in April. We used to. And so we had a charter change in April of 2023 that changed everything and said that we take in notice information. It used to be 200 feet within the boundaries. And then we changed the charter when we updated the Board of Adjustment. There were 2 ballot questions in April of 2023. And she and I changed it so that we take feedback from the residents of Denver, because it's the residents of Denver who elected us, and we at city council sent that charter change to the ballot all as a group. So I could send you that information, but that was a change, because I have a boundary. My whole council district is, half of my council district is a boundary, and I think it was one in Kendra Black's that we were discussing that had a weird, so for District 4, that had some input, and so we made it very clear in the charter, April of 2023.
The charter change to kind of add a finer point on that is related to the protest petition. Which is where we require 20% of property owners within that boundary,
But it was, if they,
not notice.
it was, I don't believe it was the notice, but it was that we didn't have to take their opinion.
So those properties outside of the city that are basically still
They can't
within
add to
the
the
boundary
petition.
wouldn't be part of the protest petition requirement. However, we believe we do still notice those property owners outside of the city, and if they made a comment, it would still make it into its public record, whether or
Can't-
not you as a
can't
councilwoman
prohibit
would
comment.
consider it or not. Would be your decision.
But I will say that that happens within the city too. Like, at the ADU, our planning board ADU hearing, someone showed up from a neighborhood that is nowhere near where the ADUs are being implemented, and they came and spoke against it, so we can't stop people's public comment, nor do we want to.
Correct. So I just wanna thank you, and that helps clarify. I just wanna make sure that in this process, we have people with Denver addresses that live in unincorporated Arapahoe County.
The address, city name is basically where the closest post office is.
All right, ready?
All right, thank you. Just wanna make sure they know that too.
Yeah. Councilman Flynn.
Thank you. A couple of questions, going in order. Consistency with adopted plans. The recommendation is to retain and relocate provision for a community need. Question, how do we determine a community need? How many people does it take? Who gets to decide what a community need is? Is there a process for that? Because it would bother me if it's just so vague that if 50 people showed up at a hearing to say this is our need, and other folks in the community didn't even know the conversation's occurring, that could be problematic.
And I think Andrew was like ready to answer, but I'll say that's a great comment. It's exactly the reason why.
I make only great
Pulling it out.
comments.
I can answer that real quickly. It's infrequently used, but it has been used a few times in the last few years, and it's evaluated by the decision makers, so by the planning board, by the city council on a case by case basis. If an applicant makes an argument that proposed use or zoning of the land that is maybe a deviation from the plan guidance, the applicant may make an argument that the change is needed for a community need that was not anticipated at the time that that plan was adopted. And it's up to staff initially and the department and then finally the planning board and city council to determine whether they agree that indeed that criteria is met, that there is a community need that wasn't anticipated at the time of the plan. So there's not a set specific criteria. It is kind of evaluated on its own. Each case is evaluated on its own merits.
That would continue to bother me if the planning board and even council gets to determine a community need without the input of the community, but only from the applicant. So I wonder.
I think that's good, and I think that a really clear recent example to frame this would be the Housing 1000 initiative, where we have a lot of older hotels that are zoned industrial, but we do have a definite need for housing folks.
Right.
And so that's the time that this has been used to justify a change that's maybe not consistent with plans, but there's definitely a community.
Okay, and I understand there are clear examples we can make. I wonder if that would be done in all instances. I would just advocate that we think about a more rigorous process that involves the community that is determined to have the need that they didn't know they needed. Try to oversimplify it. I might be the only one who said not yet ready to remove the uniformity of district regulation after what I said Monday, which I didn't understand. I literally voted no on one of our applications because I didn't believe it met that criteria. And I think it was because there was an application that had loaded it up with so many waivers and conditions that it didn't reflect that particular zone district anymore at all, in my view. So I'm not saying we should keep it, it's just that I kind of used it once. The council, I forget which council it was, the first or the second, that I was on, unanimously voted against a rezoning proposal based in large part on traffic impacts. And so I'm curious about your discussion that we shouldn't consider that. And when I read this and I listened to Rob, when I listened to what you were saying, it occurred to me that a neighborhood plan, and especially in neighborhoods that have no specific neighborhood plan, but just blueprint is the only plan, you know, that's the lowest level plan we could refer to, doesn't plan the future of a specific parcel that might be the subject of an application. And in this case, my view, and I suppose the others who might have voted no, all others voted no, was that in this particular location, even though the map overall said, you know, future place is blah, blah, that it was a site that needed a lot of infrastructure improvements that the applicant wasn't going to make, that might come at some point in the future that we don't know, we don't fund, it's not on the plan, not on the body's mobility plan. So I would benefit from a lot more discussion on what is promoting public health, safety, and general welfare. By combining these two, combining that with the first one, consistency with the plan, with adopted plans, it presumes that they will always coincide, when in this case they did not. So I think I would like to keep them separate, right? And I think that echoes Councilwoman Sawyer's concern. I think those were the only comments I had right off the bat.
Fred.
Thanks. Thank you. A couple of, I'll try and be quick here. First of all, with regards to and following up on the health, safety, general welfare and whether we combine it or where that goes. I have to say, I think that the phrase itself, to me, based on all of the research that you guys have provided, seems redundant. And I think that the intent is perhaps more important than those words, because I think we all find those words confusing. I think the public finds those words confusing. And so one of the questions in my mind is, should we, whether it is in conjunction with the first criteria or as a second criteria, have a criteria around furthering the goals and policies or advancing the goals and policies of adopted plan? Because I think that's somewhat different from consistency. I think it's very easy to find things that are consistent with maps in the plans, but don't necessarily advance those goals and policies. And I think this question frankly came up at the legislative rezoning in District 4 and was the basis of my not supporting that when it came before planning board, because I didn't feel that it met the policies around equity. And so I think those are very important. And I think we're all looking at things through a lens of equity right now. And I think that's very important. But I think phrasing it in a way that we are advancing the goals and policies of the plan helps us in the future as our understanding of the issues that our community faces evolve. You know, equity is how we are looking at it now. There's nothing to say that in 3 years we won't have advanced in our thinking and found a slightly different perspective that is an improvement. And that I trust would be then reflected in our plans. And by saying that it advances those goals and policies would give us a path towards ensuring that we're always looking at those questions. I wanted to touch on the consistency of context neighborhood context, zone district purpose and intent. And I actually think this is really important, and I think it's somewhat underutilized. Some of this is because I'm in the midst of a rezoning that I won't speak to the details of to prejudice it, but where there is, in some cases, somewhat conflicting guidance within blueprints. And guidance that maybe doesn't necessarily reflect the reality on the ground. And so I think it's particularly important knowing how long it is going to take us to achieve small area plans for the entire city, knowing the time lag that we will have in updating those small area plans to provide the flexibility. And I think that this, in some respects, comes back to that question of predictability versus flexibility. And I worry that simply eliminating this leads us towards predictability. And it sort of says, well, look, the zoning is in the plan. And I think that if we do that, we have created plans that shackles us to making decisions based on plans that may be out of date. And I think it actually reduces the lifespan and utility, the useful lifespan of those plans. Because when we create a lack of flexibility in them, they necessarily don't adapt to what's happened in the surrounding community if changes have come. And so I think for those reasons, I think that's really important. I think some interesting comments about the community need from Councilman Flynn. And I hear exactly what you just spoke about in terms of House 1000. And I start to wonder if the appropriate place for that community need piece is when we start talking about justifying circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. Rachel.
So I wanna go back up a little bit and something Fred said is a good, on his first comment, is a good segue into my comment around public health, safety and general welfare being vague language. And I just wanna step back, and I think it's important for us to ground ourselves in, since we're having an equity and rezoning conversation. That language was designed to be vague, and that language was designed, the history of that language is that cities were saying Jews can't live here, Black people can't live here, and courts were starting to strike that down. And so the court case that was cited, Ambler v. Euclid, was a court case where they said, you know, you see these other things getting struck down, what if we just say public health, safety, and general welfare? Because then we're not naming any group of people. And the initial judge in the case shot it down and was like, we see what you're trying to do here. And the Supreme Court, and there's a quote from the Supreme Court that said it was valid, something along the lines of pigs in the parlor instead of the barnyard. And so if we're, I know the staff has done a ton of work, and I appreciate that we're having these really complex conversations. I don't know that looking to peer cities language is the right way to go. I think like embedded, the reason zoning exists was to exclude certain groups of people from certain parts of cities. And that's deeply, deeply rooted in that public health, safety, general welfare language. That's why it's vague, so that whatever people you wanted to exclude from your city, you can use it to exclude them. And so I would love Denver to sort of lead on this, and I would push us to think bigger than that and think really about what like the next 100 years of land use planning within cities should look like, and rather than nibbling at the edges of something deeply, deeply rooted in racist history and exclusionary land use policy, that we push harder on that piece. So.
Thanks, Rachel.
For the next speaker really quick,
Yeah.
I'm gonna pull this off of the screen, but back up the criteria just so we can look at them. However, if you do have other comments and things, this is still really helpful for staff just to know what other things we don't get to. The comments are gonna follow.
Thanks, Rob. I've got Sandoval, Sawyer, then Cash.
Thank you. so when I sit on the task force, and when I got this proposal, I think on my Tuesday, I think it was, I had concern about public health, safety, and general welfare. And then I thought about a rezoning that came to us for a PUD in Capitol Hill that got rid of a medical health office, and it was in a time where Rocky Mountain Children's Hospital had just declared a public health crisis during COVID for teens. And so I, for the first time, I've always, like you, Rachel and Fred, have thought about public health, safety, and general welfare is very exclusionary zoning and to keep redlining, which Northwest Denver has had in its history to keep Latinos out, is my personal experience. And then when I was sitting behind the dais and I heard this public health, and I thought about the public health emergency during COVID. And I came it through a different lens of thinking about our DDPHE and how we actually oversee public health in Denver with Denver Health. And so I actually have changed my lens a little bit when it comes to this. I still think, I said this on Tuesday, I think it gets weaponized oftentimes. I think that people will use it to keep those people out or these people in. And so I want to be able to reframe it. But I do think that after sitting behind the dais during seriously a pandemic, it really has changed my mind. And sitting behind the dais during House 1000 and the migrant crisis right now, it really had this public health lens has changed my, it's just changed my philosophy over 12 years. And I didn't think I would get there. And it was literally that PUD and city council, you all approved it on planning board, and city council ultimately got struck down. And I think all of us cited the public health because we were in a public health emergency and we needed alternative medicine to help us. So just wanted to give a little thought on where I'm coming from on that. And the other ones,
Could I ask just a quick
Yeah.
follow-up question on that?
yep,
So is zoning the best tool for that? I think we could all agree on the desired outcome. Is zoning the best tool for that desired outcome? Because you could rezone and they could do it to a different use. But
So
could
the
you have a
use-
variance for that use? Could you, like, are there other tools in our toolbox rather than this one rooted in?
there could be, but
Problematic
in this
history.
one, they were going to shut down 27 practitioners because, and they were gonna build apartments, no affordable. And so is that the correct tool to get us to this outcome either? I don't know.
Oh, so they were trying to rezone to get rid of the health clinic.
Correct.
Got it.
And build apartments with no affordable, like zero. And they said that. And so that for me, I felt that having that zoning tool of having a health clinic that had more specificity than our MX mixed use and MS, where because of Tabor, you get 100% residential and you're not getting these buildings in the middle of Capitol Hill where it needed that close to like East High School. So that I felt like was important. Now, do I think it's always the correct tool? No, I always try to stay away from zoning in that. And then the consistency with adopted plans and uniformity of district regulations. I really worked as a council person to update other policies like our accessory dwelling units. So now we have suburban form and we have urban form. And so now that we have touched more on updating those, I don't think that we need all of the consistency, the uniformity of district regulations. I think that those don't make it through. I gave the example, I think, on the uniformity of district regulations. I've only used that once to vote things down, and it was in Council District 9 on the corner. And it was a no vote from planning board. It was during the thick of COVID. We were all online, and it was the uniformity, and it was going from like a total different district to another one. And I used that criteria, uniformity of district regulations and restrictions to vote no. And so that's the only time I've ever used that. And consistency with adopted plans. As somebody who just went through the NPI, I think that those plans are really important, but half my council district doesn't have a small area plan. All I have is Blueprint Denver. And so it's really hard for me to say, is everything west east of Federal consistent with the adopted plan, which the only adopted plan is Blueprint Denver. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes they really aren't, like the built environment. I have tons of old churches in Northwest Denver that would be only single unit zoning, period. I can't get much more, and there's no other adopted plan that can give more density on these old churches where congregations are moving out and they need to be changed in that built environment. So for me, I think that this is a really good conversation and I struggle on all of these. I think some of them can be grouped together. And to Greg, to your point, I like the goals and policies. We have some really great policies that were just adopted in the Near Northwest Plan. We have great policies in the Southeast Plan. We have great policies in the West Area Plan. We need to start bringing those forward and making sure that those policies are robust so we can get the outcomes from these plans that we spend years on. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilwoman Sawyer.
Thanks. So I agree, and so number one question I had on my list was, what about the areas that have never had a plan and still don't have a plan, right? So Colorado Boulevard, there's never been a land use plan really, except for Lowry, and the specific reason why there was for Lowry was because it was an Air Force base that closed and had to be built out. So, and it's 25 years old. So, you know, that whole center section of my district has never had a land use plan at all. And I think that there is community mistrust of Blueprint due to some of the mistakes that were made in Blueprint, and it was a huge document and a huge job. Of course, there were going to be mistakes, so no judgment on that, right? But you know, I can name 3 specific parcels in District 50 that should have been zoned differently than they are, and I've had one of those parcels has had 4 rezoning shut down on it as a result. So I think that there are, I think we need to think about the long-term consequences. We can't hang our hat on Blueprint as the end all and be all, and there is no land use plan coming to that area of the city anytime soon. And so I'm very hesitant to change criteria that would allow for those kinds of anomalies, because those kinds of anomalies exist all over the city. It's just that I know about the ones in District 5, because that's what I represent in the land use that I deal with the most. So I'm very hesitant to, I have no problem with adding consistency with adopted plans to advance public health, safety and welfare, but I also think that doesn't preclude getting rid of the public health, safety, and general welfare criteria necessarily. I think that could add the clarity that you're looking for, while still allowing for a discussion about 2 totally separate things that we're talking about here, right? I hear Rachel's point about that criteria being created historically for exclusionary purposes, and that's right. But I also think that's not how it's necessarily used today. Like the language has changed and the usage has changed. And there's lots of reasons for that, including the fact that there are laws that don't allow that kind of behavior anymore. So all of that to say, when we think about our residents who want to come and want to be heard and want to be upset about something, it is our job to listen to them. And that doesn't mean that we have to take everything they say as truth or everything they say as gospel. That is not what I am saying at all. But it is our job as council members to listen to them and to give them a space for them to share their opinions. We don't have to agree with those opinions, but that they're allowed to have them. And so I'm very uncomfortable with removing any criteria that would streamline the considerations that we're talking about here to the exclusion of the public testimony of our residents. And when it comes to public health, safety, and welfare, that is the easiest one for them to understand because the other ones are very technical. And so removing that one, I think, has the result of excluding our residents and their ability to comment publicly on the criteria in general, and that's not okay with me. I do have a question sorry, do you wanna?
No, it's just about.
Okay, I did have a question about whether it was a worthwhile idea or whether the group over the last year and a half that has looked at this has considered different criteria for planning board versus city council. And the reason that I'm asking about that is because our jobs are different, which is why we are different bodies, right? The planning board's job is to look at very specific technical criteria and make a determination about whether an application is appropriate based on that technical criteria. City council's job is to also look at that technical criteria, but take other, things into consideration that fit under those five criteria and allow a space for public comment and conversation about a proposed rezoning application. So I hear what CPD is saying and I agree with you, but it sounds to me more like what you're saying is let's pare down, streamline and make more technical the criteria, because planning board should have that space to look at that criteria. But I think that a result of that is that it hamstrings city council and our role as the decision-making body and the public body, where public knows that they can come and have this conversation with us and share their concerns, whether we feel they're valid or not. So I don't know whether that conversation has happened, but it's not our job to like pare down criteria so much that everyone votes yes and we're out of there, right? That's not city council's job. It might be planning board's job. I don't know specifically what is sort of set up, what rules you're governed by and how you guys are set up. So I have to ask the question, if we want to create criteria that are so streamlined and so specific that everyone gets in there and takes a look at something, and if it's gotten to the point of planning board, then it's the reviewers have already looked at it, it's signed, sealed, and delivered, and we move on. Because I think that's totally fine for planning board. I don't think that that is totally fine for city council. And I think that in our realm, dissent is not only important, it's critically important and necessary, even if it means hours-long hearings from people, even if it means that we have to sit there and listen to some horribly racist stuff, which happens to us pretty frequently. That's the job that we signed up for. So I'm very uncomfortable with streamlining these to the point where they're so specific and technical. The public can't reasonably address us making arguments on any one because they can't understand it. And that everyone just votes yes and we're out of there. So I don't know where to go from there, but I think that's important to be said.
Sure, yeah. So, and maybe you have something to add sitting on the task force as well. As a task force, no, we have not talked about that. I'd be curious what the city attorney has to say, because I think that would certainly depart from what I see in other peer cities. They are the same criteria. It's true that the way that we are appointed as planning board members is different, right? We are mayoral appointees, but I think from at least when I see our process, we certainly see many of the similar people on the planning board and then also appear at city council. And I think as a planning board, we are considering the criteria in a very similar way that you are. In the end, there's not a vote for me, right? So I think that is different. And sometimes we can fall back on the technical a little bit more and have that expertise to lend. But I do think that the arguments that we hear being made around public health and safety and welfare, and that our considerations are very similar to yours. And so I don't know that I think that different criteria would be the way to go on that front. And I don't know what you looked at in your cities, but I'm not aware of others that have different criteria. I don't know if you have anything else to add from the task force level.
I don't think that if we go back to the intent, the intent wasn't to streamline it. The intent was to look at some of the criteria. If you go back to the history of the criteria, a lot of it is from former chapter 59, 3 of the 5. And do I want language that we're voting on in 2024, when we adopted Blueprint Denver and we've adopted neighborhood plans based in that history, no. I'm not streamlining anything, I just want newer updated criteria to bake in equity that matches our outcomes of our adopted plans and our vision in Blueprint Denver. When you sit down and you read the opening in Blueprint Denver, and I look at our 5 criteria, I think there's a disconnect. And so I want to reconnect that in equity, and that's why I asked for this for like, since I started with Councilwoman Montero in 2012, I was like, can we talk about the history of these criteria? Can we talk about the history of the criteria? Literally my whole work. And so that's mine. I don't want to streamline anything. I want things brought into 2024 and not antiquated, baked in racist, racist methodology. And that's why I updated the Board of Adjustment. It's good governance.
I mean, I support that 100% and agree with you, but I think as we're talking about these 5 criteria and what of them we might want to change or how we might want to change them or remove them, the result of that is streamlining.
But you
Even
can
if
remove
we-
and add.
Right, but we can change them. I mean, that's why we're having this conversation, right? I see the results of doing it exactly how it's presented here is streamlining those criteria and to the point where there is very little flexibility to the exclusion of our residents. So I'm just saying, let's see if we can find a better balance here somewhere. If that balance is planning board and council look at different criteria, that's one potential option. If it is starting with this approach, but making some changes to it and some tweaks to it, that's another potential option. Like, that's why we're having this conversation, so that we can put all options on the table and then consider where to go. I don't think all options are on the table here. I'm uncomfortable, and I've already said why, with some of the recommendations here.
Let's keep moving through. I've got Councilman Cashman, Angel, and then Councilwoman Gilmore. I've got you in third. I've got you all in. You said a lot of people.
Thank you, Madam President. So I think we can rewrite health, safety and welfare to require clear explanation of why you're using that could prevent the crimes we've all seen in the past. I think we can do that. And if you're looking to get rid of ambiguity, we might as well trash the zoning code. It is beyond ambiguity.
All right.
No, seriously, and the example I want to give is the largest piece of property that in my, what will be 12 years on council, is the old CDOT property at Arkansas and Birch. And 4 or 5 years ago, we rezoned 12 acres to allow up to 980 housing units, of which 150 had to be affordable. Couple 100,000 square feet of commercial. They envisioned Birch Street going through the site, becoming an old South Gaylord Tennyson type of street, and then about a 1 acre park. What we're getting 5 years later, and what people liked about that was this was a dense urban development solving our housing issues. What we're getting is 150 units of affordable housing, a 100,000 square foot King Supers, a 1.6 acre park, maybe a couple of restaurants onto that park. Totally different in all ways, whatever you were voting on that for. And I know a lot of people voted for that because of the urban nature of it. So I think we've got an example where, I mean, our entire zoning code allows for ambiguity. Developers get these rezonings to give them entitlements, and we don't have the vaguest idea what we're gonna get on that site. We think we do. We think the form-based requirements are leading to some certainty, but they're not. Except in the most vague sort of way. So, but yeah, I think we can keep health, safety and welfare and craft it in a way that it's tenable and not offensive. So that's my piece. Thank you.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Angel, Councilwoman Gilmore, then Jordan.
Yes,
thank you all for this opportunity to discuss and even go so far as to have recommendations for changing. I'm really excited about that. I want to talk about public engagement and testimony. I find that it often feels inauthentic as an opportunity. In that people come, most of the things they talk about in public comment could fall within the public health, safety, and general welfare category. And then we have to say, that's not in our purview, you know, traffic, block views, density, you know, whatever it is. You know, people moving in that are renters and hence will be perverts or whatever we heard recently. That's not in our purview, and that's not an authentic opportunity for engagement. I don't like to waste time. I don't think a lot of people want to waste their time talking, you know, just to say, oh, we got an opportunity to talk. It should be applicable. And to Rachel's point, in terms of being cutting edge, and we're here to talk about equity and zoning, equity and planning. Well, let's potentially, and you know, I know we have a lot more discussion, remove what is vague, you know, public health, safety, and welfare, and put in equity criteria on the bill. Let's put it right there. So if people want to argue against equity, they're not mincing words, they're not talking in code. And we have in Blueprint, as you said, a distinct commitment to equity. It shows up nowhere in the criteria. Why not make it part of criteria for both the planning board and council? That's cutting edge to me. That's next level. And if that's what we're talking about, let's just remove it's so vague that it's in my book, the public health safety, it just wastes time and it's not an authentic opportunity to really share and to further us towards goals of equity as we've proclaimed.
Thank you, Angel. I've got about 6 or 7 folks more in the queue and we're at 43. We're done at 3 o'clock. So if folks could just take maybe 2 minutes each to state your point. Councilwoman Gilmore, then Jordan, then Mary.
Thank you, Council President. And, I am really uncomfortable with integrating the consistency of adopted plans and the public health piece for a variety of reasons that people have already, talked about. We can't assume that the adopted plans, even Blueprint, have equity. We know equity was not necessarily woven through the plan. And so that's a problem. And then representing District 11, we have needed infrastructure. We don't have traffic signals. We don't have curb and gutter. We don't have roadways that have been built out. And quite frankly, in our district, developers get a pass. They come in, they do what they want. I can't compel CPD or the developer to require them to put in a traffic signal in my district, even though we know that that's going to be a problem going forward. And so if we scrap public health, safety, and welfare and name it as equity, then we can really get down to the business of addressing the true equity and the gaps that exist in communities of color, that if we continue along this path, our silence or our inaction will continue to negatively affect the communities of color that we all are saying that we want to serve better. And so, not combining them, but wholesale looking at something different around it would be my vote. So thank you, Council President.
Thank you, Jordan.
Yeah, so I think I agree with most of the people who said that, there's I think Councilwoman Sawyer, you started with some ambiguity is good ambiguity, and I do actually, I agree with that. I think it's, maybe I wouldn't phrase it exactly the same, but I do agree that there has to be some sort of pressure release valve that's open to some level of interpretation. Otherwise, we are just technocrats checking boxes. And I don't think either planning board or city council is made up of technocrats. We have a much more planning board, much more sort of defined or analyzed purview, but we're still made up of people who come from a lot of different backgrounds, have different perspectives, and we do hear the same testimony or similar testimony from people who come, and we should be applying them similarly. And I do think that that press release valve that allows for some interpretation is good, but it does get you in this danger zone of going into arbitrary and capricious territory where an applicant could come in and, you know, plan guidance, yes, this, but all these people are saying it doesn't fit with, you know, public health or vice versa, going the opposite direction. Having no anticipation of how those things are applied is not a good thing, I don't think. How we actually, you know, get to use them when we use them. So on that same note, the relocation of these things, the police, the public health, safety, general welfare, and the community need, just the mere relocation of them doesn't change the way we apply them. I think it's going to totally depend on how they're written. If, for instance, we combine the public health clause with adopted plans, it says has to work with adopted plans as represented by, you know, their ability to, that would minimize our ability to use it. If it's just language combined in a different place, it doesn't change anything at all, in my opinion, because we don't apply them in order, right? It's not like if you get to it last, then you make it. So I think it really is gonna come down to how these things are drafted. I did want to make a comment though on the community need one, which is one of those pressure release valves, and I think we're all really, at least, you know, I see more planning board because I sit on it, but I think at city council as well, we're all pretty good at self-regulating when we use the release valves. We don't get too arbitrary with it. But the example you gave about community need, about the, you know, house 1,000, if we were to use that as our criteria, as an example, we have a known community need for housing, generally speaking, right? Which means we would have the ability to rezone pretty much anything into a denser, you know, housing district, which, you know, depending on your perspective, could be a good thing or a bad thing. I think it's a little bit of both. But it does, that leaves wide open for us to interpret community need. And we have some big community needs that we really could address with zoning that we don't, because it generally is, you know, blocked by plan guidance or whatever other criteria we're using. So I guess that those are all related topics, saying that the release valve is good. We have to have some guidelines, I think, in how we apply them. Otherwise it could get very, very weird. We all start using it the way we define community need, the way we define public health, welfare in general, or safety and general welfare. Like I said, thank you.
Thanks, Jordan.
Just one point on the community need.
Okay.
We tied it with the emergency declaration order. And so it was totally tied to only the emergency declaration order on that community. So there was like a order that mayor had done and we had voted on numerous times. And in that emergency declaration, it called that out.
That makes sense, but there has to be instances where we collectively, both planning board and city council, identify something maybe through what we hear as a community need that does not have that same declaration behind it.
Correct.
How do we use that, you know?
Yeah.
I would also say it's primarily a release valve for people who understand the access points, have free time on Wednesdays or Monday nights at XYZ time, can provide for childcare and transportation. So like, it's not an equitable, distributed release valve.
I've got Councilman Hines, then Gosha, Melissa Mejia, then Cash. Mary, okay.
What's,
Mary.
yeah.
I've got Hines, Gosha, oh, Mary's next, I'm sorry, I accidentally copied you already.
Okay.
Yes.
I'll be very quick. I really appreciate the thoughtful conversation and the perspective that everybody brings into the room. Just with the general welfare piece, on a whole, I would really support getting rid of it as written and really divorce ourselves from that sort of racist roots of it, and not, instead of not having anything to support public comment, coming up with something better that better represents. However, if we continue with it, it's worth noting that in the enabling act, even in that super racist construct, it says it is wise therefore to limit the purposes of this enactment to these four. There may be danger in adding others as prosperity, comfort, convenience, order, or growth of the city, which I think is how that is interpreted by the community. A lot of times when we hear it referenced, it's like, but my prosperity, you know, and that's explicitly not what it's about.
Literally clutched your.
So I think that that's worth noting. And it's gonna be a continual struggle. It's frustrating to me that a lot of the times I feel like the public comment that we hear actually isn't able to influence my decision making at all. What's the point of having a hearing then? And it's disrespectful to people's time if there's no mechanism for that to happen. And with a lot of what we hear in public comment, I'm really glad that it can influence my decision making. So I think that that's a continual balance point. To the point on infrastructure, I think that we're using the wrong tool to address that. I think it's insanely important that we address that, and your examples were really good, Councilwoman Gilmore. But if we're using zoning to do that, we're setting up two barriers. And if I can't get my financing in place to put in infrastructure because it's not appropriately zoned, and I can't get my zoning for the site because I don't have the infrastructure, we're kind of putting ourselves in a catch-22. So I think it's worth another conversation on how we capture and manage those infrastructure concerns that aren't necessarily tied to the zoning of the property.
Thanks, Mary. Councilman Hines.
Thanks. Two quick things. First, did I see that there's a morality clause in the
Originally.
yeah.
We take that out. We're
Yeah,
doing
that's-
charter review committee
So
right now.
that's exactly where I was going. If there, so we say public health, safety and welfare, and if we're gonna keep it fine, but if the charter says morality, then let's review that and get it out. Second thing, so basically I was gonna say very similar. The zoning code is meant to not be, you have to learn the language. It's meant to not be accessible to the public, and I don't think we've solved that yet with the presentation we have. Like, we should empower the public to be able to advocate for what they want, and they have to call a spade, fine. I'd rather them say they want it, they don't want those people there, but I want them to say it. Thank you.
Thank you. Gosha.
Thank you. I'll try to be quick. I want to circle back on who is the community who gets to show up and provide comments. I think there are a lot of people in the community that work in the community, but they can't afford to live. Teachers, people who cook food in a restaurant. If we say that teachers in DPS schools are not members of the community, I think we have a real problem. I think they're definitely community. And I think we really need to think about the definition of who the community is, who gets to show up and contribute. The second thing is, based on kind of building on what Rachel was saying, the zoning is fundamentally exclusive, like that it was established to be exclusive. I think we continue this tradition not by segregating people necessarily, but by making it so complex and so non-transparent to every citizen. That I think the barrier of entry, ability to participate in the process in an informed way, we constantly raise that barrier. We constantly complicate things. Our zoning code is so complex. So the question is like, what is zoning for really? And who is it for? And maybe we can do better. Maybe we can think about beyond criteria and using the word health and safety and welfare, really think about what is it that we're hoping to achieve and what are the tools to achieving that. And the last technical comment about public comments. When people show up, we actually ask them, do you support or oppose application? That's the question that's in the online form. That's a wrong question because that sets the expectation that it's a vote, you either support or oppose. But the question we're really asking is, do you think the application meets the criteria? So that's the question we should be asking so people can at least attempt to provide meaningful feedback that we can actually accept. Because when people say I oppose it, it doesn't mean anything, it doesn't speak to our criteria.
Thanks, Gosha. Melissa.
Thanks. Sorry for coming late. Really glad I made it for this part. Unsurprisingly, I have lots of thoughts about public health and general welfare as language that I feel like I talk about all the time. And a huge issue with the way that we use community need, but also a huge issue with this. And I feel like I have complained about how we interpret and apply this and who gets to do that and who gets to decide what is in the interest pretty often. And I think that watering it down by combining it in this way and like sort of diminishing its importance is not, that doesn't solve the problem. Because what we're trying to, like, the fact that we're all discussing what it actually means is proof that it is doing the thing that it is intended to do, which Rachel pointed out, is to be a sort of like nebulous barrier to apply as needed for those who have access to do so. And all the ways that we're saying that it is helpful or useful has to do with things like community impact and community need that are poorly defined, and that when we talk about this House 1000 thing that came through, and I said this at the time, we can use it for a justifying circumstance here, but if we're talking about this same problem on the other side in order to oppose something that's going in, it's like, well, it fits the zoning criteria and the plan guidance, so that same criteria doesn't matter. That's the problem, and none of that is solved by combining those two things and watering it down, because we still don't understand what the impact is, we still don't understand what we're measuring, and we still don't understand who gets to decide what the public good is. Like, that's the thing we have to solve, and then we find the language to explain it, or at least allow us to have a conversation that reaches that thing. But just getting rid of it doesn't help, but like, I do think that maintaining archaic language, like, one, is not the move anyway. Like, this is a moment to redefine what the actual intent of this kind of language is in the modern day now. Like, we should do that. There's no reason to signal that like dog whistling is still gonna work here. But we have to talk about something, and it needs to be consistent. That's been the frustration that I've had from this side, that I've tried to vocalize, and that I've been waiting for us to go through this process so that we can figure out, because truly this specific piece of this only matters when someone in power at the city decides that it does, and that this project in particular is in the public interest, and then we rally around it and sort of like work backwards. But it is not clear that that works, and a lot of the public comment that we hear, yes, is things that we're glad that we don't have to take into account, but also it's a lot of things that are legitimate concerns that are that same argument, but because we don't take this criteria seriously or really understand what it is, we don't know how many people in the neighborhood also feel that way. We don't actually know if that's representative. We don't know what that actual impact is, because we haven't actually defined what this is. So sorry for the very long rant, but this is really what I've been waiting for us to work on. And like, it deserves more than just like combining them and say we're good.
I'll just add, and Councilman Cashman, you have last word, but what we don't have and what you don't have even at CPD when you're assessing this are what are indicators that tell you there's an equity issue here. You do an equity assessment at pre-app, but it really doesn't tell even the applicant. These are the indicators in this neighborhood that have hit kind of major risk area for displacement, for economic insecurity, and the things that we're actively tracking and measuring, we don't provide those. And we don't actually measure against them. And so I love the idea, Mary, on remove the problem, because this gets used even for anti-gentrification and anti-displacement arguments, though those are rare and heavily organized, right? And so it isn't the average resident who's able to articulate those and organize around them very well. But that's the only time that that would be leveraged. So I do think it is, if it's gonna be removed, and I think it probably should be, it has to be tied to something that we actually are able to balance against and track. And so that may not just be CPD's work. I mean, the whole city is supposed to be working on equity issues. And so I think that is not just you, but greater than you. And but I think it absolutely ties into the work that this is asking us to do. Councilman Cashman.
Thank you. I don't care whether we keep health, safety and welfare or shit can it, okay? What we need to do is have room to address broader issues of public welfare. And what I'm referring to specifically, I think this is from page 14 of Blueprint Denver, a commitment to climate. The science is clear, our planet is facing a global crisis attributed largely to human behavior that's changing climate patterns around the world. This environmental emergency threatens to alter our normal landscape, limiting where we can live, where we can grow our food, how we can access natural resources. As we look to our future, we recognize that reversing our contribution to climate change is critical. This is from Blueprint Denver. How we plan our city can help us reduce our drain on resources and reduce Denver's carbon footprint to eliminate our collective contribution to the climate change crisis. And this last sentence was approved by the agencies, the mayor and council. That commitment must be our overarching guide. There's nothing up there that addresses that I see. So, thank you
Thank you.
and good night.
Andrew, what's next,
I
on
can
this?
fill everybody in.
Fred,
Thank you for the great conversation. Take back internally and work through some more things and hopefully come back to you. Thank you to the council president and our board chairs who have already confirmed a second meeting date for this group, which should be on April 16th. In that meeting, we're hoping to talk about more about public input, how that's used in the rezoning process, as well as how we incorporate equity better into our rezoning process. And we're gonna get into that criterion that we didn't speak about today, which is justifying circumstances, as well as the hint, this land for community need might be better placed there. So we'll speak on that. I think, look forward to it.
Yeah, thank you all very much.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks.
Just felt like a natural.